Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us for the Glacier Book Club. My name is Doug Mitchell. I have the great privilege of serving as the executive director of the Glacier National Park Conservancy. I'm joined by two of my amazing coworkers, Amy Luck, who is going to help with questions in the chat, and Andrew Smith, who, as always, keeps things running on time and is going to do our tech and communications portion. Again, thanks everybody for being with us tonight. This is a very, very special evening, which we are doing in partnership with our friends at Chapter One Books in Hamilton, Montana. Katrina Mendry, thank you very much for joining us. Katrina is the co-owner, one of the co-owners of Chapter One, who recently was given the Montana Main Street Model Business Award from the Hamilton Downtown Association. And this summer, believe it or not, Chapter One celebrated its 50th year in business as an independent bookseller in Hamilton.
Yep.
Katrina
Big,
can
big
also
year
help
for
all.
us.
Katrina can also help us all with our fruit tree needs. She has a master's degree in soil sciences from the University of Washington, which, as you all know, is now a Big Ten powerhouse, which, by the way, has 16 teams. And you can find Chapter One Books, and I encourage you to do so on Instagram at Chapter One Bookstore, and that's the number one, and on the web at chapteronebookstore.com. Katrina, thanks for co-hosting tonight with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you, Deborah, for picking us as one of your favorite bookstores. We're really honored. It's always been a pleasure to work with you and appreciate the friendship we've grown. So thank you.
Thank you. You're my fave. This bookstore is amazing. If you go to Hamilton, you have to stop by Chapter One. All the people are just so friendly and so warm, and they have great book recommendations. And these people are readers. So, yeah, stop at Chapter One.
Well, thank you.
And they've got on hand a copy of Deborah's new book, which is The Lost Journals of Sacagawea. And so that is available online, and we're going to give you the purchasing information for that. So please go online, support Chapter One, our local independent bookstore here in Hamilton, Montana. And they've graciously agreed to donate a percentage of proceeds of the sale of the book to the Conservancy. So we're keeping that circle of support going. So thanks, you guys, and thanks, Katrina, for spending some time with us tonight. Really appreciate it.
I'm excited to hear the conversation. I've been wanting to discuss this one with Deborah for literally years.
Well, weigh in anytime. Again, this is really an amazing experience for me. I was saying earlier when we were doing a little pre-meeting that I stalked Deborah many years ago to have her sign a first edition hardcover copy of this book when it first came out. And it is now in its a new printing, which is super exciting. And it's fun to see the book reaching a whole new set of readers. And we're really excited to bring it to our Glacier Book Club. So let me talk a little bit about this amazing person we'll get a chance to be with tonight. Debra Magpie Earling is the author, of course, of Lost Journals of Sacagawea and Perma Red. She's received a National Endowment for the Arts grant, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and the Montana Book Award. She worked for a long time at the University of Montana, where she was a professor, where she worked in the fiction area, and retired, I think, in the 2020 or 2021 when she was named Professor Emeritus. She is Bitterroot Salish, and as I understand it, was involved as maybe one of the first public defenders in the tribal justice system on the Flathead Indian Reservation, and went to the University of Washington, as did Katrina, and holds an MA in English and an MFA in fiction writing from Cornell. Her work has appeared in numerous anthologies, including the iconic Last Best Place anthology, edited by William Kitteridge and Annick Smith. Deborah, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you. And thank you to all of you who read my book. I'm appreciative.
And you're joining us from a writer's retreat in Port Townsend, Washington tonight.
Yes.
How did that writing retreat come about?
Well, you have to apply, and I don't know how many submitted this year, but you have to apply, and then there's also artists and other residents. And to be honest, I wasn't selected at first. I was, and then I guess there was a cancellation and somebody else, the woman who runs the Centrum invited me to look at the schedule and see what would fit. And so here I am, but it's one of the most beautiful places to write. So my phone is going off. I'm sorry.
That's all right. That happens to all of us. So as I prepared for tonight, I read a number of things and went through the book again and was moved as always with it. But in one of the pieces I read about you, you indicated that it took you about 20 years to write Perma Red. And I'm not good at math, but if my math is relatively correct, that means you started the book, at least it had its inceptions in your mind in the early 1980s, even before you began your graduate work. Talk to us a little bit about that time in your life and how you decided to become a writer and particularly to tell this story.
That's a big question. It didn't take me that long to write it. It took me a long time to sell it. And it took me a long time to find, I guess if I was rewriting it, it was to different agents who wanted something else from my work. So I had to rewrite it again. And so it wasn't until I got with a literary agent, Sally Wofford Durand, and I was so pleased to get with her after all these years of trying to sell this novel in some form or the other. And she said right off, "I love it, and I want to represent you." So it was a long sort of pull. But I think the genesis of Perma Red started, when I was a child, because the story is based on the life of my Aunt Louise. And many of the characters who appear, like the grandmother was my great-grandmother, Cecile Charlotte Vandenberg. And yeah, so Louise kind of, I kept trying to get her right, and I'd bring the story back to my mother, and she'd say, "Well, when you write toward the life of a person or about the life of a person, you really want to get things right. You really want to do the best job that you can. You want to portray someone in the best light possible. And you also want to just understand their lives." So I kept trying to get the facts right. And I would give it to my mother and she'd say, "Well, that's a very nice story, but that's not Louise." And it wasn't until I gave up the idea that I could capture someone's life, and it wasn't until I realized that life is sacrosanct and that even if we live with someone for 50, 60 years, we don't really know that person. When I finally gave up on that and I wrote about Louise as a person who experienced some of the things that I had experienced, my mother said, "Yes, that's Louise." So I think when we animate our stories with our genuine selves, with experiences that we've had, that's when they become kind of living characters on the page.
And did you always know that you wanted to be a writer? Or was storytelling part of how you grew up? And is that something that, at a young age, you kind of said, that's what I want to be. That's who I want to be?
I didn't have any sort of direction in that regard, like this is what I want to be, or, I want to be a writer. But I do know that I was guided by so many storytellers. The fortunate thing about being so young and being in the public defender's office, I got to work with the tribal judges, and a lot of times I just spent time with Louise Burke, who was the associate chief judge. And she would just tell me stories, and she'd tell me all about, her culture, the Kootenays, and told me long stories, really beautiful, passionate, powerful stories. And I learned stories as a public defender. But I grew up in a storytelling culture where if I did something wrong, I was told by my father that I did something wrong, but my mother would sit me down and tell me a story. And so I just had a fascination with stories, and I'm fascinated with people's stories. I love listening to, somebody sits down and says, "Well, boy, do I have a story for you." I I love it. I love the art of oral histories and oral lessons. And so I tried to transfer that power to the page. So I think from as long as I can remember, I loved it. And then it wasn't until I got to the University of Washington, I actually wanted to go into law. I wanted to go back and I thought, represent or help my people in some ways. But then I realized when I wrote Perma Red, I wrote it in James Welch's class. It was a beginning level writer's class. And that story made it all the way back to the reservation before I got home again. And I had one guy come up to me. He was a white rancher. And he told me, he said, you know what? You made me think about things a little bit differently. And I thought about the power of story, and that's when that just pivoted right. I thought, boy, being a public defender or being a tribal court advocate, you're always against something, or you may be championing someone, but you're always kind of against something else. And I wanted to be kind of a person who got to tell stories and maybe make a difference in this world, maybe make a difference in the way that people saw, my tribal culture or where I come from. So and it has worked out that way, I think.
And Welch must have been an interesting kind of mentor or guide in that way. Clearly kind of opened the door to some extent. Was that a kind of a seminal relationship as you developed as a writer?
Oh, I love Jim. He was such a powerful teacher. The thing that he taught me really was to listen. If you ever sat in Jim's presence, he had forgive me, but I thought he had these like really round dark eyes, like black eyes. And when he'd look at you, he'd just like be really intently looking at you. And he reminded me of a beaver, the way like a beaver will sort of track you. And I thought I really believe that that I must have been so engaging and so engrossing that I would show up in one of his novels. Fortunately, I didn't. But he just had that way about him with everyone. He was fully engaged. He listened to people. And it really shows up in his writing. The natural, gifted storyteller that he was came from, I believe, all the experiences that surrounded him. So he was a wonderful and masterful teacher. He never wrote on my papers. He would have conversations with me, and he would do this wonderful thing. He would go read my story, and then he'd go through and he'd say, what happened right here? And then he'd do this kind of thing as if he was conjuring. And he said, do you have something? Do you have something like that? Do you have a place? Something's missing here. Do you have a piece, a story that would make me understand why this character is behaving this way? And so a thought would just pop right into my head. And, he had that ability to just go right to the heart of a story. So I learned a lot from him and from many of my teachers. So I'm grateful.
That's a terrific story, and I of course could have this conversation by myself all night long, but that's selfish. I want people to put questions in the chat. Amy's going to curate those. She may ask you to unmute and ask your question, or just feel free to holler out. I want to just, and for those of you who aren't familiar with Welch, if you've already ordered the Lost Journals of Sacagawea from Chapter 1, go back to your cart and put in Fool's Crow, because it's must reading for sure. And that's an incredible story to have been in community with him. To me is really I'm a fanboying at this point, because that's such a unique experience. I want to go back to the trouble kind of selling the book, which I think for all of us, which is all of us here who've read the book, that just doesn't make any sense. It's so extraordinary in so many ways from the opening pages. I wrote down dialogue. I make these little notes when I read books, and I wrote down dialogue from one of the first two pages where you wrote, she felt she had opened the river to her heart. She felt he had opened the river to her heart. I mean, I just don't know how someone comes up with a sentence like that, and how a publisher doesn't immediately call you. Do you think the public wasn't ready yet for Perma Red, and we're more ready in 2024?
Well, spoiler alert for those who, if you want to mute, if you haven't read the story. The story is based on my Aunt Louise's life. And so at the end of the story, the original, and I think it probably would be published now, but the original has Louise's death. And so they said, well, you can't kill off the heroine. And so all of these publishing houses were,
Mm.
I didn't have I was a kind of a broke professor at the time. And I remember I had to get one of the phone cards. They didn't have cell phones at the time.
Wow.
I would leave my cabin and I would go into town about every 2 to 3 weeks, and I'd call my agent and she'd say, oh, great news. There's all these editors who are really enthusiastic about this. And then she says, call me back in, a couple days. Then I go back into town and she'd say, they all passed. And they all passed because they said, you can't kill your heroine. So it wasn't until, she kept at it, and I finally said, she goes, at one point, I can't remember how many phone conversations I had with her where I drove into town and be the same thing again and again. All these publishers are passing, and she said, our editors are passing, and she said, I just can't believe it. I'm a New York agent, and she goes, they're acting like Hollywood or something. She goes, they won't take this story. And she goes, I just refuse to believe this. And so finally I said, would it help if I change the ending? And she said, well, I don't want you to. And so I went home after one call where my agent, who was like, she's a tough New York agent, and she had tears in her. I could hear tears in her voice, and I thought, I'm going to change this. I'm going to do it. So I went home, and I was crazy. It was like 3:30 in the afternoon, and by probably about 4 the next day, rewritten the story. And I asked my mother. My mother cried. She said, "You gave me back my sister. What it may have been like if she would have lived." So I don't know that I don't know whether people would take a character who died. I think now probably, but maybe not. The very final scene in the first draft, or the first vision of Perma Red was Louise has a voice. She doesn't speak throughout the story, but at the end she speaks. And if I may tell the story about what
Yeah,
really happened.
please.
My mother was 14, I think 14 or 15 years old the night Louise died. And so Louise was in a car accident with two men, two white men, and her car had careened over an embankment. And my uncle believed that she was still alive. He was a Gandhi dancer, and he was called down to help stop the train that was coming because the car was on its top. And he said they pulled Louise from the car and they put her on a flatbed railroad car. And he said she was breathing, and she was he goes, I could hear her moaning, and they said, oh, that's just rigor mortis, but he could see her breath in the dark. And he was like, but they kept him from her. Louise was pretty wild, and she agitated a lot of policemen, tribal and non-tribal police officers who were at the scene. My mother was, after Louise had died, she was taken into St. Ignatius, this mortuary. And they picked my mother up. The sheriff didn't want to go all the way out to Perma, so I picked my mother up. She was staying the night at a friend's house in Dixon. Somehow he'd heard about that. Picked my mother up, and he drove her into St. Ignatius. It was 3 or 4 in the morning, and he wouldn't wake the undertaker because my mother wasn't important enough to do that. So he went around the building, and everything was closed. The doors were locked. And then he found a window that was open. He opened the window and called my mother to him, and he saddled his hands and he pushed my mother through. And it happened to be the room where Louise was. And she had a sheet covering her, but my mother saw her hair in her hands. And she said, "That's my sister." And he said, "I want you to take that sheet off." And she wouldn't do it. But I think back on that story and how, that is certainly a devastating and powerful story. Maybe people would be ready for that now. I'm not sure. Maybe nonfiction is a place to write that story.
Thank you for sharing. I think we all need a moment. That's really compelling and heartbreaking and moving. And I do think that we as consumers of literature have gotten a little bit better about consuming disappointing main characters, right? If Goldfinch and a lot of other books kind of introduce us to kind of dysfunctional main characters. I'm a big fan of Louise Erdrich. I'll read anything she writes, just as I'll read anything you write.
Yeah.
And it feels like, Roundhouse, for example, I think it's a hard book, right? It's moving, but it's also moving a little bit in the difficult topics it raises, and I think we're getting better, I hope, as people to be welcoming to those kinds of stories, because I think they're how we grow as people who haven't had that experience, right? That's not a part of my experience as a child, and I can only know it if you're willing to share it with me. I want to suss out one little thing, and I wrote this on one of my little notes.
Oh, yeah.
You mentioned that Louise, didn't use her voice in the book, and I was actually taken by the fact that you chose to write Charlie in the first person and Louise in the third person, and I was interested about that thought process and how you come to that.
Well, I've noticed that when I wrote the original novel, there are 7 first-person characters, so I had to cut them down. I talked to my editor and he said, "I recommend you cut them down. Yeah, I'll give you 2." Louise was always one of those people who people made stories up about her. They always, she was always cast in some ways in third person, and especially because she died so young. And she reminds me of all the people, all the gifted people who die young on our reservations who, there's stories about them. They never have the opportunity to really have a voice of their own because they lose their life too soon. So I kept that aspect of her. But as I was writing, I realized that third person is an incredible tool to really get into the heart of someone. Because a lot of times, a first person character isn't able to express what they truly feel or what they would like to say because they're limited by their education or how you posited them in your story. And so Louise was I learned something about the way that she saw the world. So it was kind of an interesting choice, but cutting all those down, I think the hardest part for me was cutting Jules Bart, because Jules Bart had a really interesting voice, and Jules Bart was gay in the first novel, and that's why Harvey Stoner had it over him, because it was the 1940s. And Harvey Stoner knew something about him and was going to out him. So, so he had a great voice. And there's a scene where he goes to kill Baptiste for champagne, and he can't do it. And so he finds a stockyard where there's a horse with the same shading and kills that horse, the glue horse, to compensate. But his voice was, I really, if there's one character that I'd like to resurrect, it would be Jules Bart.
Well, speaking of characters, Andrew was good enough to come up with a little survey. I'm interested as we start our discussion. And again, Debra, thanks so much for being with us tonight. here's our kind of poll for tonight. Who is the most, to you, who is the most compelling character? And we're going to give you Baptiste, Charlie, Harvey, Jules, Bart, Florence, and Grandma Magpie. Those are your choices. Put in your voice. Louise obviously is everyone's first choice. So we're going for the other characters. Well, looks like we have a May. Well, here comes Grandma Magpie from behind. So somebody who says Grandma Magpie, I need a volunteer to unmute and tell us why you chose Grandma. Come on, you're all brave.
I really liked Grandma Magpie, and I was very struck by the fact that she could see it all unfolding and couldn't help any of it.
Yeah, that's super. Oh, go ahead.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, that's super interesting as I think as a parent, and now I'm a new grandparent, that's you are one step removed, right? You've raised kids to have their own place in the world, and then when they find that place, you're a little bit removed. That's super interesting. We're gonna also tonight give away, as I mentioned, a couple of copies of the Lost Journals. So Andrew will be selecting our winners here soon. And Amy, Lucky, I know we've already got some questions in the chat, so I'm going to hand it over to you, and we'll get the conversation going.
Awesome. Thank you, Debra, so much for not only just sharing your book, but sort of your heart and your feelings and your stories. So lots of people had reactions to the story that you shared about Louise, and just sort of the incredible trauma that specifically your mom went through with all of that. So that's it's interesting to hear that Louise was based on somebody in your family. So Sarah has a great kind of lots of questions pertaining to Charlie kicking woman. And Sarah, I'm wondering if you'd be interested in unmuting and asking Debra your questions.
Sure, thanks. Let's see. I found him a really interesting character. I guess you already answered how he got his own perspective, but I was wondering, is he based on anyone from real life? And I found him interesting because I felt like he undergoes a character change throughout the novel, and I'm interested to hear you reflect on, what you see as motivating him to grow in that way.
Are you talking? I'm sorry. Are you talking about Charlie?
Yeah, sorry, Charlie.
Charlie, well, I worked as a public defender in the tribal court system when I was really young, and at the time, the Flathead justice system, I didn't have a prosecutor. I would go up against tribal police officers. And so I heard these heartfelt I had to represent my clients, but I would hear these heartfelt, like heart-rendering stories about pleading with me. And I was so young. And not to do a good job, because these people needed help. They should be jailed. They're out there drinking, they have kids. And so there was just a point when I was writing, I realized that Charlie was a conglomeration of these men that I had worked with, these tribal police officers who actually saw before the moccasin telegraph hit the reservation. It was they saw what was going on. They saw the tragedy. They saw wondrous things. They saw spooky things on the highway. They were alone. They were battling these things. They were battling their own insecurities. And so it was kind of a conglomeration of everyone. And the thing that I find really curious about it is so many people have told me from my own reservation, they go, I know who Charlie is, or I know who Baptiste is. Well, Baptiste is really he's based on a man that my Aunt Louise loved, but He's also, just an imaginary character, but all characters in the novel are based on someone and have like a kind of a powerful thread back to someone. I think Charlie in particular, I was really interested in the ways that someone can change in this world, that somebody can be just so fascinated by someone, want to save someone so badly, especially, people on a reservation. There's like, these wonderful young people who have so much to give, and you see them taking the bad road, or you see them making the wrong decisions. And so he just saw himself as a person who could save someone. And how does that feel to come to a reckoning with yourself that, your desires are also problematic, come to an understanding. So I was really fascinated by that. I think working as a public defender, I really wanted to save people and realized in many ways, I was just saving myself.
Joy made a comment. She said, "Thank you for Luis's life" at the end, and I would have to agree. Glad that Luis lived. And Kathy made the comment, "I found this book to be a challenging read because all the characters were so deep and complicated." And I'm curious, did you know how deep and complicated they were when you were writing the book, and sort of how compelling they were? Because that's what kept me reading as well, as the characters were just so good.
Thank you. One thing that I did, which if any of you are writers out there, I really recommend this. I had so many characters when they said, you got to act these characters. Can't have all 7 first-person characters. And there's one character that I really liked. She was a friend of Louise's, but she was kind of a tag along, like a 14-year-old that really admired her and did stuff and was kind of saw her as like a romance figure and out of one of her romance novels. And so I had to cut Myra. So I was really disheartened to cut Myra. Then I thought, is there any way to get Myra into Charlie Kicking Women? And I did. And there's a scene where Charlie is looking through the screen door of the Dixon bar and he sees Louise with Baptiste. And Louise is drunk and she falls, and Baptiste catches her and then carries her out. And, her throat is exposed and she's being carried out and so Myra thought that was just the most beautiful thing. And so I filtered that through Charlie's vision, where he found himself thinking, I'm like a romance, I see it as a romance novel, but the hard truth is this. And so when you have characters that you have to erase or collapse, Baptiste was another. He had a brother who was was connected, was a medicine person. And so when I moved those 2 characters together, the hard Baptiste and his brother, then Baptiste became a deeper, more significant character. And I think, when I think about it, when I think about developing characters now, I think of how we're all these things. We're all different things. We are a 14-year-old girl. We're the older man in baggy trousers. We're the person on the wrong side of whatever political divide we're on. We're all of these things. And so, to really thread that out, to think more deeply about, just the human condition and the human condition at odds with itself was really important to me in that novel.
Wow, I think Gina actually has a great follow-up question to sort of what you're talking about here. Gina, would you be willing to unmute?
These are all wonderful questions. Thank you.
My question is, how do you write about such personal and painful family experiences? Obviously, your mother was very connected to this. Do you separate yourself from it when you're writing, as though you're writing about maybe completely, even though I know they're fictional, not even based on your family? Or do you actually try to draw closer to those experiences and get more inside them?
I think it's a combination of both. I just recently, when I finished the Lost Journals of Sacagawea, and I was writing, I had a very short timeline to write that. My editor gave me 6 months. And so I wrote it in 7, actually. I'd been working on it for a long time, but the actual practice of writing it. And I realized as I was writing it, I feel when I write, I just feel gleeful. I have a giddiness, and I like the sounds of words, and I love like when a sentence comes together and I think, I think that's it. Because I think of everything, this land, all the things that surround us, the trees, the mountains, the dirt itself has a particular sound and smell and scent. So I try to capture what is that. And as I was writing, I have that kind of giddiness and those discoveries. But when I put it all together, I just set it off. I finished the last thing. I read the last piece to my husband, and he goes, "That's great." And then I sent it off. And so I was on this program called The Right Question with Lauren Korn, and I started, she goes, asked me to read an excerpt, and I got really emotional. And I thought, oh my God, this is really a hard story. I didn't realize it. I get so caught up in the power of, storytelling empowers you. And I believe it empowers you in not just a simple way, like not just like I feel giddy or I feel happy, but I think it gives you, when you start telling a story that means something to somebody and might change someone's life, you will feel a power in it. Whether I taught storytelling for years, and I realized when somebody would come up and they would tell their story and they would tell it without guile, and they would say honestly and deeply what had happened to them or their family, they become very powerful to do that. And you feel the shift in the room when that happens. And so I think we all have that. We just are kind of afraid sometimes to inhabit it. Thanks for that question. Thank you all for the questions. It made me think.
Thank you for the answers, Debra. It was really insightful. I feel like this could go on all night. So I'm going to let people know right now that Debra has graciously accepted our request to sign book plates after the conversation. And so if you want a book plate, you can send your name to info@glacier.org. Feel free to put your name in the chat too, but sometimes that gets a little crazy, or we leave the conversation, we maybe don't have anybody, or have everybody. So you can always email to info@glacier.org and we'll get that. And I wanted to announce the 2 winners who will be getting the Lost Journals of Sacagawea, Debra's new book. So Lindsay Brandt, congratulations, and Cheryl Taylor, congratulations. We will make sure that you get a copy of the new book. I do have a few more questions. Doug, should I send it back your way for a speed round of sorts to break things up a little bit, or do you want me to continue with questions?
Let's go over to our friends at Chapter 1, and then come back and I'll do a speed round and close with some questions. How about that?
Sounds great.
All right.
So Katrina, I know you started a question in there, but feel free to.
I started it, and then she started to answer it as I was writing it. And then of course I accidentally pressed enter. But I think, we've featured Perma Red twice in the bookstore for discussions. And one of the things that has always come up for us is like, wait, did Louise die? Did Baptiste die? Are they married now? Wait, the ambiguity of it kind of always left us wondering. And because so much of the book kind of has you in this like fevered dream of what's reality and what's happening in everyone's actual lives, I'm curious if when you rewrote the end, if you intentionally left it just a little ambiguous, or if that was more just how we read it.
Well, I think what happened to be really honest about the process, I think that writing a piece, you direct it toward a specific end. People read a story for the end of the story, you know. So the impetus in the story was Louise was going to die. Her life was framed by tragedy. And so you can kind of feel the buzz of that, you know, as it's going through the story. There's a deeper tragedy, there's a deeper melancholy about her life. There's a, you know, kind of an overwhelming sort of sadness about it. So resurrecting her is, you know, I've had several people tell me that, well, it feels like they died. And it feels like they all, like Champagne, also the horse, when he returns, like a whole fresh thing. And I think, well, maybe sometimes in order to, you know, she is in this terrible car accident, and he has been beaten so badly, almost to death. And Champagne is, you know, was let out into the wilds of, you know, outside of Ronan, and just
Yeah.
he's returned. So they all have, you know, I think we die into a second life. You know, you know, as we gain more maturity too, we see the world in a different way. And, you know, Baptiste, even though he was abusive to Louise, he wants to change. He doesn't want to be that person, and he, you know, throws away the bottle and
Yeah.
declares a different life. And I think Louise, after all of her running, finally realizes that she does love Baptiste and that she does want a life with him. And, you know, so it is, you know, it is that, like, even with all the sorrow, you know, the last line is she stepped forward. And
Right.
that's, you know, that can be read as, you know, in the other, she stepped forward into the next life.
Yeah. I think I always sort of wanted to see it as a rebirth because I'm a sucker for a happy ending.
It is, I think it is a happy ending. It's
Yeah.
supposed to be a happy
Yeah.
ending. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's a beautiful ending. And one of my big questions for you is, you know, the release of this edition of Perma Red was the 20th anniversary. And I feel like it's sort of received like it's a second ovation. And how what has how is your experience different from when it was first published to when it was re-released by Milkweed? Um,
You know, my first experience with the publication of Perma Red, my mother was still alive, and we went, she'd go with me. She liked to go travel with me. And so I remember going to Great Falls, and there was this young woman who drove. She goes, I drove 100 miles to see you because this is my story. Like, Louise is me. And she wasn't the only one who said that to me. So I had many Native women who would hold my hand and cry and tell me their stories. And it was, I couldn't thank people enough for reading my work. I couldn't, you know, I couldn't hold all the sorrow, it seemed like. And it was the first go round was kind of rougher than I thought it would be. It sounded like, oh, your book is out, it's going to be so fun. And I found myself sitting in some hotel rooms, and this sounds terrible. I mean, I've certainly faced awful things in my life, and I know so many people have, but sometimes I'd sit on my bed and just cry, the hotel room by myself, and cry. The people's stories were so hard, the people who came to see me, and I had long lines and a really great reception. And I think I was too young to really, and I wasn't young, but I wasn't mature enough somehow to accept that. And now, I'm just so grateful to all the people, especially on my reservation in the state of Montana, all the Native people across the state of Montana, and many people who, you know about the Perma region and stuff, and they have treasured this book and held it. I've seen copies of Perma Red just all threadbare and falling apart, and people passed it around forever. And so when it came back, it just felt like a whole different, like a rebirth for me too. It was just such a happy thing.
yeah. Well, congratulations, because you certainly, like, you know, I think it was our second bestseller that year it came out. At
I
the
want to know who
bookstore.
the No.
Yes. I know. I'm sorry. Lost Journals might have been the first. I don't know. But yeah, when we're in the bookstore, I'm always encouraging people to read Perma Red first and then read Lost Journals, because
Yeah,
I think
I think so.
it
I'm
really
not
can
nice.
open up the
Okay.
Lost Journals for them.
I'm not nice. Okay, I'm just gonna tell everybody. I was like, even my editor when he came, like Daniel Slager, the CEO of the head of Milkweed, came to introduce the Lost Journals of Sacagawea to Missoula. He said, my family thought it was funny because he said, this book is not an easy read. This is a hard book. And I thought, well, thank you very much for the compliment. I just thought it was kind of funny. But I gotta say, it's not. I wasn't nice to my readers.
Not
I just thought I wanted them to experience what it would be like to be thrown into another culture, to be thrown into a language that you didn't understand, and to see if you could understand it. So you become much like Sacagawea. And so the learning curve is pretty steep in the beginning of the book. But people say, like, once they relax and they quit trying to fight the book, that it goes a lot better. But it starts going faster and faster and faster the closer that Sacagawea gets to to the white men, to Lewis and Clark. So a lot of it is about her and what she sees as important, not what not what Lewis and Clark felt was important.
Yeah. Well, and I don't want to I will say, I don't want to get too far away from the discussion of Perma Red, but I will say, after having read the Lost Journals, I read it as an advanced reader copy, and there was no one to discuss it with. And it left me just like, oh my gosh. And then I met you at a conference. But for all the people who are going to go read Lost Journals, definitely find somebody to talk to about it, because it's a great book to be able to discuss with people and talk about those bigger issues of how we tell stories and whose stories they are, and how much she's been exploited, but also like what a powerful story she has to tell. And you did a wonderful job doing it. So I hope everyone will read that one as well. Should we turn questions back to the audience, or Doug, do you want to?
Sure. I can I'll launch my speed round.
Okay.
Again, these are very silly questions, and you'll notice that I'm both very book and food oriented. So this is really going to be just local knowledge, and we're going to educate a lot of our friends about some very important issues related to Missoula, Polson, etc. So my first question is Polson related. Julie and I, my wife Julie and I, we have to go to opposite sides of the street. So the question is, when you're in Polson, do you go to JJ's Doghouse or Oak's Korean Kitchen?
Oh God, I haven't been to Polson for a while. Is JJ's out on the?
So they're literally directly across 93 from each other.
Okay, my sister used to own that. And
so you got Korean barbecue and Polish sausage.
Okay, I'm going across the river.
Oh yeah, okay. All right. Okay. And my wife really loves the Oak's Korean Kitchen, very authentic.
Okay, I'm gonna try that.
Okay, there you go. Okay, so I watched a piece with you and Louise Erdich. And so I'm not going to ask, favorite authors or anything like that, but I am going to ask you to choose Roundhouse or The Night Watchman.
Oh, geez.
No.
I can't. No, I can't. They're both like fabulous, don't you think? I mean,
I think they're, I think they.
It's like
it's like your best kids. So just read both is what we're going to just say.
Both. Yeah.
Okay. So we'll switch down to Missoula and we'll go food. Old Post or Top Hat?
Oh geez. I mean, I'll get in trouble with all these people. Old Post, I think that I love the Old Post. I used to schedule readings there too.
Okay, so I'm going to ask another book choice, but this one I think there's less at stake here. Ooh, I did that. MFA from Missoula, Andrew Sean Greer, winner of the Pulitzer Prize. Are you going to go with Less or Less is Lost?
Less.
Yeah, I agree. Less is just
he was one of my students.
Right. Amazing, right? I mean, and you guys have turned out some real fabulous students
Yes.
and
Yeah.
books out of that. And that, again, if folks
Emma George.
keep your keep your cart open at Chapter 1 books and throw in certainly less. They're both really good. And then Julie just came home with ice cream, so that made me ask the following Missoula question: Sweet Peaks or Big Dipper?
Big Dipper.
Big Dipper. Good choice. I have always said our son thought that their punch card should be in the shape of the Big Dipper, and you punched out the stars.
Oh, hey, that's smart.
Right?
Boy,
Yeah.
an entrepreneur.
And now it's all online. So
How do you pass up cold smoke ice cream? Geez.
there you go. So Amy, I think we've got some more questions in there, and we've got about just about 10 minutes.
We do. First, I'm going to give a shout out to the homemade tater tots at the Top Hat, but I would also go Old Post. But if you find yourself at the Top Hat, the homemade tater tots, unreal.
Close. Okay. Swinging back.
There you go. So I would love for Andrew to unmute because he has a comment, and I know he loves the book as much as we all do. So Andrew, do you want to read your comment and ask a question if you have one related?
Sure. Yeah, I was just going back through the book today in preparation and looking at all the passages I had underlined, and I noticed so many of them were about characters either thinking about like their own Indianness or how Indian a different character was. And especially with like Kevin and Baptiste. And Kevin, like, it really felt like he was caught between worlds, being a police officer. So other people didn't see him as like fully Indian, but then the police officers don't treat him quite as one of them either. And then the way everyone looks at Baptiste is like he's like the epitome of what it is to be Indian, and people like both are like revere him for that, but there's also sort of they despise him in some ways for that too. So this was just sort of back when we were talking about the poll question of what you find most compelling. But I thought just the way that Kevin was like trapped between worlds with his role in society as a police officer was a really like interesting idea.
Yeah. That's really a topic that I think is troubling and fascinating, especially in Indian country, because there's been so many policies, federal policies, and even in some way state policies to assimilate Native people, to erase their culture, to say who's Indian and who's not. Just today, I've known Louise Erdrich for a long time, and one of the things she told me was she often gets the thing, and I just got that today. Oh, are you Indian? Are you Native? And I said, yeah, I am. And she said she had people tell her, oh, you are. Well, you don't look like you're Indian. And she responds, you don't look like you're rude. But so I thought I'd try that out on somebody. And there was this older woman who said that to me. We were in a pool, and this one woman said, hey, this woman is like a writer, and she's like Indian. She's from like Flathead. And this woman goes, oh, well, you don't look like you're Indian. And then I used that, and I said, well, you don't look like you're rude. And it wasn't me. She started crying.
Oh.
And I thought, oh, I made it I thought that just went south. It didn't go the way it was supposed to go at all. So I wouldn't recommend that either. Anyway, side story about identity.
Oh man. Janet had another sort of related question, but just asking, do tribal police get more respect today? Have things changed?
I can't even measure that because I respect them so much for the work that they have to do, the miles that they have to drive, the interventions that they have to make, how they put their lives in danger, how they protect us. I would hope that they have the utmost respect, but I think I think, we're in trouble on, many reservations. We're in trouble by the non-natives who live on our reservations and, the kind of acrimony that they have toward Native people overall. So anyone trying to enforce a law, trying to protect, or trying to do something to mitigate with our crazy laws, they resent that. And unfortunately, the way that people choose to vent their frustrations or resentment is to ridicule. And I think tribal police officers, both men and women, have a difficult time. Yeah. But I admire the heck out of them. I worked with them. I know what they do.
Difficult and dangerous. So thank you for that.
Dangerous. Yeah, dangerous. Always.
And I would think that it also, like any small community, but maybe even more so, the fact that you may get called to a family member's
Yes.
house, where there's lots of complexity, makes that more difficult than maybe a sheriff in Napa County California, who lives in Marin County, who doesn't know anybody who lives in the town he or she is policing.
And your relatives too. You know who everyone is. And so those police officers know, how they're related to somebody. They know the history. And that's in some ways a really good thing because they can mitigate a lot of issues, but they step right into the heartbeat, the heat of passionate arguments. And that's a dangerous, dangerous job. Plus being on the highways, the reservation, the Flathead is really, over 1 million acres. So these men are driving, or women driving those roads, on icy roads. It's, yeah. So
yeah, and asked to do some things. It's Glacier is also 1 million acres, and rangers there have, they have to do so many things, right? That it's not just they're sitting as a detective reading reports. They're having to, pull people out of the river or do whatever. It's a full on job. Well, as you can see from the glare in my eyes, the sun is setting here, and the sun is setting on our time together.
Looks beautiful on you.
But I want to, before we leave each other, talk to us about what's on your bedstand reading. What are you reading these days? What should we be reading?
Let's see. I would recommend James by Percival Everett. I love that book. Is first, reacquaint yourself with
Huck Finn.
Yeah. And then read because you don't have to at all. It doesn't require that, but it's just kind of fun. And so that's definitely, I keep going over and over that book. I knew this was going to be asked, and I have all the, a lot of the books, I have to say, because I'm writing a novel about witches and the boarding school. So a lot of the books that I'm reading now are pretty dark stuff about, about witchery. I've done research at Cornell University, so on witchcraft, and there is some spooky. I had nightmares. I never have nightmares. There's some spooky stuff in those old grimoires.
Wow. Yeah. James, I mean, interesting. I was going to mention that when you were talking about the lost journals, right? And looking at a story from a different perspective, which is, obviously what James is about. Debra Magpie Earling, you are a wonder. Thank you so very much for spending time with us. Katrina, thank you. And your partners at Chapter One for partnering with us tonight. It was a treat to have you guys. Yeah, absolutely. And Glacier Book Clubbers, thanks again. We have one more this year. We're going to gather again in November. I will actually be live with the author at Book Passage in Northern California, talking about the life and times of George Menendez Wright, who was the first Hispanic kind of senior person in the National Park Service and the first kind of national park biologist. So we'll see you all before then, if not before. And Debra, thanks again. And
thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
We'll look forward to seeing you on a trail here soon. Thanks, everybody, and good night.
Thank
you.
Thank you.